Well, logic is a strong word that I don't think applies to thinking inside Washington. I think we're dealing with people that are acting largely on impulse. If everything you've done has failed, and that's been the case with the United States, what do? You try something else, but you do not stand up and say, look, this has not worked. So we're now going to try to negotiate because everything else we've done has failed. No one will stand up and say that in Washington. The original goal, go back and look at the statements that were made back in February and March. Look at the proposals the Russians submitted in December and January of 2021 and 2022. We rejected all of those proposals, all of those related to troops and weapons placed on Russia's borders. We would not even entertain them. Then once the Russians were goaded into action by us in February of 22, then we said, well, Russia has to be harmed. It has to be harmed to the point where it no longer presents a threat to us or anyone in Europe or anywhere else. Then we said the regime really needs to change. Then we said, no, we don't want to change the regime, but we really think that Putin needs to go. I mean, we've been down this sort of confusing road with vague goals that are outrageously unrealistic and always were. We said we're going to harm the economy. Well, that hasn't worked, but we've harmed ourselves terribly. We've done enormous damage to our lives. Perhaps America's most important ally in Europe is Germany, and we've done enormous damage to Germany. We say we don't want the Germans and the Russians to cooperate, yet we're creating conditions that would lead the Germans to conclude that they're better off cooperating with the Russians than they are cooperating with us. So everything that we've tried has backfired. Instead of a rational discussion, which is what you're looking for, that re-examines all the steps we've taken, looks at what the Russians have done, and saying, let's talk, let's halt all operations at this point, cease operations, meet somewhere with Russian representatives, we, the United States, and discuss what can be done to end this conflict. We're not doing it. We've said we absolutely will not. That means that you then look at the inventory of weapons at your disposal and you say, well, what else can we use short of a nuclear weapon that's going to harm the Russians, that will theoretically induce them to cooperate with us and negotiate, which of course is absurd because this is not about weapons. This is about territory. It's about the presence of NATO and NATO capabilities on Russia's borders. We don't want to talk about that. We won't even accept the possibility that Ukraine could be something other than a member of NATO. So under the circumstances, what is the basis for negotiations? What's the basis for discussion? What's the basis for talks? I don't see any. The Russians would love to sit down and talk to somebody who is willing to examine where we stand. No one will do it. So that's why I call this phase of the war, it's no longer the Ukrainian phase, it's now the Biden phase of the war. And the Biden phase of war is long-range strike. Now, why anyone in Washington would think that by destroying targets inside Russia proper is somehow or another going to endear Russia to us and persuade the Russians to throw up their hands and say, please stop, we want to talk, we'll give you what you want, is beyond my imagination. It's the dumbest thing I can imagine. If anything, it's going to persuade the Russians that they must attack and attack decisively to the West. That is not, in my judgment, something that is in our interest or in the interest of NATO. But I hold the minority opinion, Glenn, and no one agrees with me here in Washington.
Well, there seems to be a weakness in the logic. I saw recently Mitt Romney giving an interview where he said that, the investment in this war was excellent because for a mere small percentage of the military budget, they were able to kill a lot of Russians and weaken the Russian military, which is great because they have so many nuclear weapons. So we would like to see them weakened. It's I had that face expression too when I read it because it just seems let's call it a risky policy to seek to militarily attack and degrade an adversary which happens to have more nuclear weapons than anyone else. But But in terms of this escalation, this Biden phase, as you termed it, it's well, one can see that. Well, one can argue there's possible two objectives. One would be to get a stronger hand in the negotiations or future negotiations with Russia, and others might see that this is a way to go into a direct shooting war with the Russians, or simply to degrade them. Is there any mood in Russia? Is there an appetite in Washington for actually fighting a war with Russia, or is this just hoping that we can degrade the Russians without them retaliating, or is it to set the tables favorable for negotiations?
Well, you've raised a couple of very important questions. First of all, I would argue that there is no appetite in the American electorate for a war with Russia. I don't see any evidence for it. Even among Americans who, for reasons of the Cold War hangover, continue to view Russia as something evil, I've never heard any of them express the willingness to go to war with Russia. So I don't see that in the United States anywhere. No one is talking about a war with Russia. No one wants a war with Russia. People are anxious to avoid war, period, because they look at what's happening on our southern border. They look at what's happening inside the country, where the money is going, millions of dollars going to people that are not even Americans, billions. You know, we've got 37 million people who live in the United States who are American citizens below the poverty line. Now, you have to stop and consider that for a minute. 11 million children who go to bed every night hungry. So the question on American minds is, why are we doing something about that? Why are we pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into a potential war that we don't really want to fight? I think this is becoming more acute, which explains why you're hearing more people stand up and question what's happening in Ukraine. When I say more people, I'm talking about the average American citizen. The media doesn't cover it because the media is 100% in line with the people controlling our government and controlling the financial sector. They want a war with Russia. That's a small minority, but they're very well financed. So when Mr. Romney opens his mouth and makes these ridiculous assertions, he's really expressing the view held by his donors. Now, he may be a billionaire, but he's part of the club of other billionaires who want the war with Russia. And then, of course, you have someone like Elon Musk, who has the presence of mind to say, we don't want a war with Russia. It's a very stupid idea, which is why he explained what he did about terminating the Starlink connectivity in Ukraine to prevent what he feared would be an escalating attack on the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. And of course, he's then pilloried and attacked and assaulted verbally for all sorts of reasons. People are hurling abuse at him left and right, but he's one of the leading billionaires, but he's also one of the very few that won't join the war party. So Washington is in the hands of the war party. They own it. They have an appetite, but they don't understand what the hell they're doing. They don't even understand what war means. You know, how many people who've been wounded from this war or by this war in Ukraine and Russia will never recover? Well, I can tell you on the Ukrainian side, it's very high. If you have 200,000-300,000 people that have been wounded, more than half of those who've been severely wounded will never return to duty on the battlefield because the Ukrainians cannot even evacuate all the severely wounded in time to save their lives. They can't provide them with the medical care they need to save their limbs, their minds, their eyesight. The Russians can do those things. They're much better organized and better positioned to do it, but the Ukrainians cannot. Are we going to join this? Are we willing to join it? I don't think so. And again, if you look at the numbers of U.S. forces, ground troops that are in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, there aren't enough there to launch a serious offensive into Ukraine. And of course, we'd be at risk of counterstrokes against us, counteroffensives by the Russians, not only in Ukraine, but through Belarus. So we'd open up several fronts that we cannot possibly cover and sustain. So there is no rational thinking. It's all impulsive. It's all emotion. It's not rooted in the basis of any serious analysis.
I think it was Obama who expressed concern, given, if you're going to fight on the border of Russia, its logistics will obviously be superior as it's closer by. But with what is the current infrastructure for the United States? What would be its main strength and weaknesses if it would fight Russia?
Well, remember, you've got an alliance of 32 nations. How many of those nations that are members of the NATO alliance are excited about the prospect of being pulverized by Russian attacks from the air, missiles, rockets, whatever? I mean, are they all rushing to get in line to provide air bases, forward, refueling points, forward rearming points for NATO forces in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Romania, in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia? In other words, that's what you'd have to do. Germany would become virtually a logistical fortress. You'd have to have several million troops, to be blunt, because not only do you need 1 million men on the front lines, you'd have to have another 1 million in the infrastructure, sustaining everything. None of the European powers are prepared for this. It would take years for us to create the foundations for what I just described. So it's an impossibility. So we're playing a very dangerous game. We're bluffing. You can't bluff about these things. And keep in mind that at some point you'll want to reinforce your troop presence as well as your ammunition, your medical support. Everything has to be reinforced. How do you cross the Atlantic in a war with Russia? You can't. You're going to lose all the ships quickly that you try to send across to Europe. They'll sink them. They'll disable them with their submarine fleet. And then you have aircraft that can also attack. In other words, everything we do depends upon our ability to project power, which includes logistical support thousands of miles across the ocean. How do you do it? How long would Norway last in this kind of setting? Norway is in very close proximity to Russia. And if Norway says, we'll provide NATO with everything it wants, how long would it take the Russians to pulverize every single militarily useful position in Norway? How long would it take them to destroy every port facility in Norway, Sweden, Finland? A few days? A few weeks? And then how do you repair it? How do you recover? How do you launch offensive operations at that point? People are not thinking these things through. I can guarantee you that the Russian General Staff has thought these things through. I can guarantee you that everything is targeted with high-end conventional precision munitions. Now, is that really the road we want to go down? We haven't even discussed the long-term strategic implications for the West and Russia and the world. The economic dislocation, which is already severe, but it's going to get a lot worse quickly. So I think there's a complete absence of rational thinking in Washington, and there isn't much help coming from Berlin, Paris, or London. I haven't heard any. I haven't heard anything out of Oslo or Stockholm or Helsinki that makes sense. God help us all, because this doesn't make sense. Well, one of the things that many of us that are not on the side of this war have warned from day one, as far back as January 2022, is that the Russians have the potential or the capacity for horizontal escalation. That means Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela. These are places where the Russians have friends and allies, where they can position capabilities and assets that can be employed against us. When I say capabilities and assets, take your pick. You can put almost anything you want on the ground in Mexico or Cuba or most of Latin America and launch it at the United States. There's no one there to stop you. The cartels will cooperate, particularly if they think they stand to benefit long-term from it. Strategically, criminality is always willing to cooperate with anyone if they think this is going to improve their position. Beyond that, remember, we're admitting millions of people to our country about whom we know nothing. We have uncontrolled borders. We have open ports. Our coastal waters are not under persistent surveillance. We've got real problems here in the United States that could be exploited in any number of different ways. So that's part of the answer. You've seen already the willingness for the first time of the Russians to provide modern intercontinental ballistic missile parts, missile bodies, missile technology to North Korea. North Korea now has the capability to deliver a nuclear warhead from an intercontinental ballistic missile launched from North Korea that could reach the United States. That was not true in the past because President Xi resisted any attempt under any circumstances for that capability to emerge. They did not want it. China did not want it. But China relented and decided to go ahead and allow this to happen because China also feels threatened by us. If you're sitting in Beijing and you have a total of 6 nuclear submarines, and the United States insists on talking about your dramatic military buildup and why the United States should be prepared to fight China, finally you decide, well, we've only got 6 nuclear submarines. The rest of our subs are diesel electric and limited to coastal waters. More than 100 of our 300 ships are pure Coast Guard vessels for coastal water patrol. Most of our Navy is not capable of long-range operations. Our armies are not organized to go anywhere and fight. Well, I guess we better support the Russians, because if Russia fails for some reason, we're next on America's menu. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, people are listening to what we say. They are looking at where we're spending our money, and they are looking at what we say we are prepared to do to them. This is catastrophe. We are building alliances against us. We're causing people to take actions they would otherwise not take, such as the one we just saw in North Korea. Now, people will sit back and say, well, the North Koreans aren't crazy. They're not going to launch such a missile because if they struck us with a nuclear weapon, we would incinerate North Korea. I tend to think that's true, but nevertheless, the prospect is terrifying to me that you have a state like North Korea with that capability. Is that an accident? Of course it's not an accident. That's a clear and unambiguous signal from President Putin. We've done this in North Korea. Where else can we do similar things? What kinds of things can they undertake in the Middle East? They have friends in Iran. They have friends in many Middle Eastern countries. Remember, the BRICS is now admitting the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are going to do business in something other than dollars. What does this mean for the petrodollar? In other words, we've done enormous damage to ourselves across the range of human activity, and we don't seem to pay any attention to it. We're not thinking about it. We're dismissing it. We are emotionally committed to destroying Russia. That's insanity. Because if you were looking at anything from a rational perspective and you look at Ukraine on the map, the first conclusion you reach is, gee, this is wonderful. Let's have a neutral Ukraine. If the place is neutral, that puts hundreds of miles between NATO forces in Eastern Europe and Russian forces in Russian Europe. Isn't that a good thing? Well, of course it is. But what have we done? We've destroyed that option. We've resisted that option because the objective is not to promote peace, not to create stability, not to find a balance of forces and interests with which everyone can live. Instead, it's to destroy another country. And why should we be surprised that the Russians have reacted the way they do? It's insanity. I would react exactly as the Russians have. And I think we should expect the Russians, given these long-range strikes, to answer our strikes in kind.